I am so delighted to be here as part of the Radcliffe Institute this year. It's a gift. And as you know, I've entitled my remarks this afternoon, Telling Stories, Allegories on Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism. What I hope to do, and as Meredith said, this is part of a larger effort I'll be making here to develop tools for a national campaign against racism. So there are two things that I want out of this afternoon from you. The first is I want you to listen to my stories, remember at least one of them, because I'll be sharing 4 stories, 1 on race, 2 on racism, and 1 on anti-racism. I want you to listen to the stories and remember at least one so that you can share it with a family member or a colleague or even a stranger on the street. The second is that I'm going to be sharing a framework for collective action against racism. And so I'm really hoping that you'll see some piece of your work connecting with what I'm trying to do with my work. And we don't have to do that in a formal way, but I'm just hoping that there'll be some kind of inspiration that you will join in this national campaign against racism. The first story about race is to help us understand what race is and what it's not. And this is particularly important in the health sector because when we have, for centuries, documented race-associated differences in health outcomes, but not vigorously investigated the underlying causes of those differences, people have started to believe that there are biological differences between the so-called races. This is a dangerous practice and a dangerous way of thinking in our country. So this first story, which I call Japanese Lanterns, Colored Perceptions, was actually sparked by my experience as a medical student. So here I am, first-year medical student out at Stanford, invited to a faculty member's house for a garden dinner party outside. And I was so, overwhelmed to just be there in that mix. So here I am. The garden is festooned with Japanese lanterns and colored light bulbs. It's an evening party. I'm chitting and chatting. And eventually I get a little weary of that and decide I'm just going to retire myself to the corner of the garden and let the music and conversation just wash over me. And as I sat there in the corner of the garden, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths. And then my gaze shifted. I said, oh, and look at the green moths over there and the blue moths over there. And I was really impressed by the beauty and also by the fact that these moths were kind of sorting according to their kind. Now, already you're like, really? Did you really think this? But I did, okay? So I really did. And then just about now, it occurred to me that if I had looked behind me, I could have been noticing yellow moths and purple moths and orange moths, still sorting according to their kind. But you know these insects that I'm talking about? You know that they don't come in pink and purple and blue and yellow and green and orange. Moths are different colors, yes, but they're different colors of tan and brown and speckled and splotched. And the colors that we think we see, the colors that I thought I saw, were actually due to the lights by which I was looking, where the colored lights were distorting and masking the true variability. So this image made me start thinking about what is race, and how do the racial categories that we construct color our vision of who we are. And it just brought home to me that race is a social classification. It is not a biologic descriptor. It is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. And the same race that might be checked off for me if I were to, by a medical admitting clerk, if I were to go into a hospital, where that race might become part of a health statistic, that same race is the same race that a taxi driver notices, or a police officer, or a teacher in a classroom, or a judge in a courtroom, and it's that race that has profound impacts on all of our life experiences. This reification of race, this idea that race is something that permanently attaches to a person, is particularly dangerous when we value some colors in terms of the moths more than others, when we construct nets around the lights. And the most pernicious effect might actually be when the moths themselves start thinking that they are pink or blue or some other color without recognizing what we could see if we looked under a universal light that allowed for all possibility, without recognizing their full humanity or mothnanity or whatever you would say. So I offer this story to you. It's one that I don't tell a lot. I'm still exploring it, and in our question and answer thing, if you have something that you wonder about this or some way you want to add to that story, I would be delighted. But now, understanding that race is not biology, that it's a social classification of people in our race-conscious society. I'll just say another thing about that. Look at me right now here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and most of you would agree that I'm clearly black. But if you were to look at me in some parts of Brazil, I would be just as clearly white. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be clearly colored. So here I am, same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those three settings would assign me to three different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would probably take on that of the group to which I was assigned. My educational outcome, my housing outcome, all of these things would take on that of the group to which I'd be assigned, even though I'd have the same genes and abilities in all of those places. And that's not just true because I'm a light-skinned black woman. I dare say that for every single person in this room, there is some other place on this earth where your so-called race would be completely different from what you are living right now. So I'm going to stay. I've done my race piece. We can talk about that later. But now I want to shift to racism. That shift is a very important thing that we're still doing in the health sector. People are still very much on race and not understanding that we need to name, measure, and address the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. But now in my storytelling, I'm going to help you understand why that is. So the second story, which I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, was also sparked by something that happened to me when I was in medical school. So I guess I was really open to stuff or whatever. So as a medical student, of course, I was very studious. So one Saturday, I'm in my apartment studying with some friends, and we're studying long and hard. And it got late, and we got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment, which was typical. But never mind. My friends understood. We decided we're going to go into town and find something to eat. Now, you guys are looking at me like, why is she talking about this? Let me tell you, the end of this story is some insight about racism. So just stay with me, right? Okay. So we go into town, we find a restaurant, we walk in, we sit down, the menus are presented, we order our food, food is served, here we are eating. So you're looking at me like, what? Because, you know, most of us in this room have had this experience, so it still doesn't give you that big insight about racism. But as I sat there eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and that sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now you're intrigued. Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now I know I've lost most of you again. Okay. Let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open. If I hadn't thought anything more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that now, because of the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed. And that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And that's when I understood how racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures a dual reality. And for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it's difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So it is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except on the health side of things, we got a little taste of that with Ebola a few years ago. But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those who are on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the restaurant again? Let them come in. You will make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you do is pass food through the door. Maybe you try to break the glass or tear down the sign. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So when I have 5 minutes to speak to a group about racism, this is the story that I use now, to help us understand that we live in a society that is structuring two-sided or multi-sided signs, and that racism, yes, could exist even though your whole life experience has been about open. I once had a 3-hour conversation in Flint, Michigan with a community group. I was just going to open with this story, right? And I asked the question, how could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And we talked for 3 hours. We didn't even get onto something else. So I'm not going to ask you that question now, but if somebody wants to talk about that during our Q&A period, I'd be happy, because there are many, many ways to know. But now I've talked about race, I've talked about racism, but I haven't defined racism. So let me provide you with a definition. When I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but I am talking about a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? On what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. We already talked about that. What are the impacts of this system? Well, when we do think or talk about racism at all in this country, which is getting more frequent, there's pluses and minuses to that, right? Because we used to live in a society that was in staunch denial of the continued existence and profound impacts of racism. Now, because of the white supremacist, just killings and, all of that, then we're talking about racism even more. But so when we do talk about racism, we understand that it's unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some white people, uncomfortable. And I recognize that by saying those words, unearned white privilege, I may have made some people in this audience uncomfortable. And I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you 2 more stories. So I used to say, if you feel uncomfortable, shake it off. But I don't say that anymore, right? What I say now is, if you feel uncomfortable, lean in. Because I've come to recognize that the edge of our comfort for all of us is our growing edge. But even as I've now posited that racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, there's a third impact about racism that we hardly ever think about, and that is how it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many examples of that. I think I'll just give you 2, maybe 3. The first one is how we as a nation are not vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders of racism have made some people feel like there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those children. But of course, there is genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. And I sometimes say we might already be up on Mars farming, if that were a good idea, right? If we were to invest in all of that genius. These blinders that don't value all of us equally have also sapped the strength of the whole society by making us as a nation complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that did not separate us from human potential. And if you know folks who are either stuck in the prison system or cycling in and out, because when you come out of prison with a felony conviction, it's hard to get a job, it's hard to get housing. In many places, you can never vote again. So we have to interrupt the cycling. We have to welcome our returning citizens, but we also have to interrupt the disproportionate incarceration. But I started to say, if you know any of these people involved in the system, then you know that there are many geniuses caught up in this system that, if there had only been some other way, could be contributing quite productively to our society. I actually think that this impact of racism, how it saps the strength of the whole society, through the waste of human resources, is the impact that we really need to be lifting up right now. We need to be talking about that. We need more media coverage about that. We need more data collection, students and scientists. We need more conversations around our dinner tables about how racism is sapping the strength of the whole society, so that we have more people filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. Before I leave this slide, I just want to say one more thing. So for 14 and a half years, I worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the first 10 years were good. I went there. I was recruited to come and bring attention to racism to the nation's lead public health agency. But then after 10 years, I moved to a different part. Long story short, I was supposed to start something up, then they decided, oh, that's not going to happen. Long story short, I encountered severe resistance to my even talking about racism. And the person who had to clear my presentations said that I needed to take that second point about unfairly advantages some individuals and communities off of my slide entirely, because I'd already talked about the unfair disadvantage. And the compromise, as long as I stayed there until I escaped to the Morehouse School of Medicine. Oh my God, it was really something like that. Right, the compromise was that if I took the words unfairly off of both of those top 2 points, then I could talk about that. Well, right. But what that showed me, that experience was very enlightening for me, because it made me understand there was not just this one person, but there are many people in this country who think that there are 2 states, disadvantaged and normal, right? And the reason that many people think that there are these 2 states, disadvantaged and normal, is that we as a nation are ahistorical. So people do not understand that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. So now, I know you're like, this is a long stretch between stories, but here, I'm going to talk about how racism could get into the body, because I am a health person, but this is also how racism turns into all kinds of outcomes, educational outcomes, housing outcomes, and the like. And I find it useful when I'm thinking not only how could racism turn into differences in the numbers of our babies born, or babies dying before their first birthday, how differences in asthma prevalence and the like, how could racism get in the body? I find it, as well as what can we do about that, to think about racism on 3 levels. So I call them institutionalized. I published this paper 20 years ago. I was talking about it 30 years ago. So this institutionalized is what people would call structural racism now. Okay, so institutionalized or structural. Oh, I skipped. Okay, well, let me go to this, okay? I didn't realize that I was going to put this in here. I did another and. Anyway, that's an inside joke. Before I leave that definition of racism, I just want to say that that definition can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So you could say, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I recognize that there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today. They are intersecting in communities and in individuals. And all of these are at least working as risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value is assigned, even as a smaller set of them are actually risk factors in the progression to disease and other adverse states. I usually put this at the end of a talk because I like to explore the racism piece and then say, yes, I recognize that there are many systems of structured inequity that share the same structure. I put it here now so that people would know that I know this, but also to answer the question, why am I spending all of my time on race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system of structured inequity if I recognize all of this going on, right? And my answer to that is that racism is foundational in our nation's history. And yet many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. So I actually think that all of us need to be addressing race as the axis of inequity and racism as a system. All of us need to be actively anti-racist, even as we engage in some of these other struggles. And to the extent that we're able to dismantle some of the mechanisms of racism, these other struggles will benefit as well. So now I'm going to get to how to understand how racism could impact health or other things by looking at 3 levels: institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism. So I'm going to define each of these levels first, give you examples of how they can impact health, because I am a physician epidemiologist after all, but you can go into your own sectors and your own fields to see the parallels. And then I'm going to illustrate them with my third story, my gardener's tale allegory. And I'm just interested, how many in this room are familiar with the gardener's tale? Oh, okay, so a smattering. So for those of you guys who are familiar with it, I want you to listen with different ears so that you can hear the nuances of the storytelling so you'll feel confident telling it back. For the rest of you, when we get to that, just sit back and enjoy. But first, the definitions. So institutionalized or structural racism, that's the system, if you will, the system of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. So this is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our norms and laws and in customs and the like. It shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage, and we see it in terms of material conditions as well as in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing by race, or equal educational opportunities by race, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly those things can impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access, differential access to a clean environment, and the whole very well documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus depots in communities of color. And in terms of access to power, power which could be information, so it could be health information or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, and power as voice in media and government and the like. I just want to quickly take a short segue to say, on this slide, sometimes, and I didn't invite you to ask me questions along the way because I knew that if I did, then we would never get through all of the time, and also they're taping it, and we didn't ask your permission to be taped for questions. So please hold your questions to the end. But sometimes when I'm talking, I do encourage people to ask questions, and a question I usually get right about now is, excuse me, Dr. Jones, would you look at that top set of examples, housing, education, employment, income, isn't that what we call social class? Dr. Jones, why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really talking about social class? That is an important question that many of you are holding in your hearts right now. So I'd like to address that, and the first part of my addressing that is to acknowledge that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for example, for American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land and the near genocide, and then moving survivors to reserve lands. And then in some instances, something good was found under a reservation. Oops, you gotta pick the people up and move them somewhere else. I usually go through a whole litany, talking about people who for centuries have lived in Mexico, who never crossed the border crossed them, and now their great-great-grandchildren are being harassed and even mistakenly interred, along with the other. We have a very interesting relationship with labor through the years. Of course, there was the enslaved labor. I'm going to come to that in a minute, but even Chinese laborers brought to this country to build our railroads, unable by law to bring their families and unable by law to marry. And right now we have many, especially I'm from Georgia, many migrant laborers who are mistreated and all, and as the so-called whatever our 45 is doing, is making the farmers in Georgia worried. Who's gonna pick the strawberries? Who's gonna pick the peaches, right? When I talk about internment, whoever thought that the kids, that the babies, that families would be separated and all, but we've had histories of internment before. Even when you talk about the Japanese Americans who were interred during World War II, while the German Americans or Italian Americans were not interred. I mean, there are many, many histories. Well, let me get to the history of African Americans, where that initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But when I start talking like that, some people are like, ooh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and we are now in 2019, which makes that 154 years ago. So Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase is in their question, all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are present-day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and each of these other initial historical injustices that I described. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So when somebody asks me, are you talking about racism or are you really, really talking about social class? My response is that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. That is a very important aha. I don't have time to do this, I'm looking at my clock. So I'm not gonna go deep on, of course I care about poor white people too and poor every kind of people, right? And this is not an either or. It's not you have to be anti-racist or anti-poverty. It's a both and situation. I will say that institutionalized racism can manifest as acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often it shows up as inaction, lack of action in the face of need. The second level of racism that I call personally mediated racism, I'll talk to you about that in a second, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. And I call it personally mediated racism, although that's quite a mouthful. Other people might call this interpersonal racism, but I call it personally mediated racism because I am still understanding racism as a system. And this is the system mediated through people. How could it impact health? Well, lots of ways. Police brutality. My memory has grown short. I used to do a whole litany of unarmed Black and brown men and women who were killed by police officers, right? So, Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and, little baby Tamir Rice and Sam Crawford, lots of people. I can't remember all of them now. But all I have to say is not only do each of those deaths take value from our communities, and not only do each of those deaths shatter families, but there are whole communities just bracing ourselves for the next occurrence. Because for the most part, police departments have not been held accountable for those killings. So that impacts the health not only of the person who's gone and their family, but for whole communities. Physician disrespect, which could be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't understand or wouldn't comply, or could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. And these are just two examples of what some people call everyday racism. The microaggressions, if you will, the subtle communication of disrespect that might even be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. And then a very important manifestation of personal, can you guys see? I know, yes, around me, right. The very important one is teacher devaluation. Because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that child can't learn and puts them off in the attention deficit disorder track, that child won't even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Like institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism can be through acts of doing, as well as acts of not doing, but even more important is to recognize that it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I'm going to define here from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Now, I have friends who do anti-racism training who say, well, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people are walking around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? Indeed, it is. And for a long time, I just didn't have it on the slide because I didn't understand how that could cause bad health outcomes. But now I'm recognizing that perhaps it's a sense of entitlement thwarted that is related to what people are describing as the diseases of despair or some of the opioid epidemic, which wasn't an epidemic 40 years ago when it was primarily hitting another population. That's another whole conversation, right? But anyway, but I don't have that on my slide right now. Right now, I'm speaking from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races, where examples include self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school, or apply to that college, or try to get that job, or live in that neighborhood. The white man's ice is colder syndrome. That's a real phrase, that comes from my parents' generation. What it meant back then for black folks and other people of color, it still means for many of us today. So let me give you an example. Say I'm black and I need a lawyer. I might seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if I'm sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the black doctor. Or if my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Internalized racism turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, turns into so that turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, but also turns into not registering to vote or not voting even if you are registered, which also has health and other impacts. And basically, internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. The moths believing that they really are blue, right? So now, I want to tell you a story to illustrate these three levels of racism and what we should do. This is another story based on my own real-life experience. And for this story, let me tell you what I saw with my own real eyes first, and then I'll come back and make it a story about racism. So my husband and I had been married about a year, and we were moving back down to Baltimore for me to finish my PhD at Hopkins. And so we bought our first freestanding house. Cute little house, big wraparound porch. I think about it, I was finishing my PhD and we bought a house. I guess we knew how long that was going to take. But anyway, so we bought the cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And it was October when we bought the house, not really the time to plant in Baltimore, but when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, ran out with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our cute little house. But then he came right back in, and he says, Camara, some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. I need to go down to the gardening store. So he goes down to the gardening store, and he hauls back big old bags of potting soil, and then we fill up the empty boxes. Then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds, and we put them in all of the boxes, and we water them all. And I am not the gardener in the family, so by this time I'm exhausted, so I just sit back, gonna be delighted. About 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door, and I finally pay attention to these flower boxes, and what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks. Because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and the plants were tall and vigorous looking. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that we bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the potting soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died, but even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And some of you guys are nodding, so maybe there's some gardeners in here. And maybe you've composted half of your garden, so maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes. And the image, of course, is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. Pink seed she throws over in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed is sprouted, strong red seed, tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes the strong pink seed struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens. Till finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized racism works. Where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You have the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in this garden? Where the gardener's looking over at the red flowers and thinking, oh, the red flowers are so beautiful. Then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks the pink blossoms off before they even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or perhaps even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine, and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. And the bees are just minding their own business, collecting nectar, but pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, into one of the pink flowers, and then bzzz, to another pink flower, and bzzz, to this pink flower, and this flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red. Because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start out by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. I'm not making light of it. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. No, it's good. It's all good. So we have our workshop, right? And in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in the garden, we must address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, Or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier if it's going to be the same gardener for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, it means you need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you'll also have addressed the internalized racism, because pink won't be looking over at red thinking red is better and wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized, you might also address the personally mediated. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up seeing the flowers equally beautiful will be much less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized racism. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But there's one more important question that I haven't asked yet, and that is, who is the gardener? Right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. Media, foundations, corporations, communities, to the extent they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red, which is why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So our challenge is, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can come out of this story. And I want you to think of your questions. We're going to have Q&A in just a minute. But I do want to share with you two questions that have come up before from previous groups with whom I've spoken. The first question was one of these, another, like, Dr. Jones, excuse me, but why should the red flowers share their soil? When I heard that question, I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism that might otherwise be difficult if we're talking about racism between you and me. My answer to that question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers, it belongs to the whole garden. We won't stay there, we can discuss that some more. The second question I want to raise is, what if that's not the original gardener that we're looking at? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And that great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flower boxes looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, there are three parts to this. The first is that we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. So we have to put it on the agenda. We have to prioritize that. The second is, how are we going to do it? Even though we have it on the agenda, addressing that difference means that we must make those flower boxes transparent. We need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. And then the third part of it is, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we also need to make sure that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we have to talk about history, and we have to talk about the gardener's agency in setting up the whole situation, how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink, what some people would call cultural racism, or in our setting is white supremacist ideology, how that set up the whole situation. Because if we do not address that, even if we were to compel that gardener to enrich the poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So I used to be very much a structural person. I used to think values was all about religion or philosophy or something, but I'm really understanding, as I defined racism as a system of doing two things, structuring opportunity and assigning value, we need to address both of those if we're going to set things right. So, because I want to say, before I move to the third thing, so I spoke a little bit on race, I spoke more on racism. This question, how is racism operating here, is a very important and legitimate question, because if we're going to move to anti-racism, we need to understand the mechanisms, right? And it's a legitimate question because racism is not a cloud or a miasma you can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, which are in are structures, policies, practices, norms, and values which are elements of decision-making, where structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And I encourage each of you, when you find yourself at a decision-making table, your first job is to look around and say, well, who is not at this table who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job is not just to represent their interest, your job is really to find them a way to the table. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, then policies are the written how of decision-making. Practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. And again, for a long time, I was missing values, missing that piece, but I think that we really need to address that, including white supremacist ideology, if we're going to get any traction on this. So now, this is just something to show you how you could use this to really identify mechanisms. How is racism operating here in terms of police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women? Well, structures include the presence or absence of citizen review boards to monitor police departments and keep them accountable. So that might be a lever that you could work on, right? In terms of policies, the use of grand juries to bring police indictments. It's not enough that the police officer shot the gun and the person's dead to say, oh, there was an issue there. So that could be something we could work on. In terms of practices, the over-policing of communities of color that cause more accidental interaction. In terms of norms, the blue code of silence. Kind of in police departments, if an officer sees another officer doing something bad, well, they just didn't see anything. Maybe that's something that we need to try to intervene on. And in terms of values, the view of Black men as inherently threatening, which makes a fear that a police officer feels legitimate or understandable. Maybe that's something that we have to work on. So here with this one little example of trying to use this question, how is racism operating here, looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, in this one instance of police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women, has given us 5 possible levers. I encourage us to take this question with us to our workplaces, in our kids' school, everywhere we are. How is racism operating here? So now I'm going to shift to the last piece, anti-racism, which is a very important piece, because it's good to document the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. We need more research on that. It's good to have people understand and be able to say the whole word racism, but we need to act. So when I was president of the American Public Health Association, I launched, and that was in 2016, so 3 years ago, I launched our whole association on a national campaign against racism, encouraging other associations and communities and all to join us. And there have been a lot of little seeds planted that are bearing fruit already. But there were 3 tasks in this national campaign against racism. The first was to name racism, to say the whole word, right? So it's good to talk about disparities, disproportionalities, implicit bias, race, cultural humility. There's lots of good things to talk about. But if you never say the word racism in the context of widespread denial of its existence, then you are complicit with that denial. So we need to say the word racism, but then we need to go beyond that to ask, how is racism operating here, looking at the mechanism so that we can intervene, and then we need to organize and strategize to act. So I'm going to just very briefly share with you my idea for an anti-racism collaborative with 8 collective action teams. I'm going to share with you guiding questions from each of these teams, and I'm going to walk back here so that I can read this out loud to you guys. So the first collective action team on communication and dissemination would look at how can we support the naming of racism in all public and private spaces, and what tools and strategies are needed to start community conversations on racism. So ideas like songs or billboards or community dinners. There's a whole Decatur dinners. They had 1,000 people on 1 hour on a Sunday a few weeks ago, convening in 100 homes, hosted 10 people in a home talking about issues of race and racism, that kind of thing. The second, education and development. How can we support training around issues of race, racism, and anti-racism at educational institutions at all levels, including from K-12 up through professional schools? And what does effective anti-racism curriculum look like? Right? So there we get some of the trainers together and we pull together all the best approaches. In terms of global matters, how can we use the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD, which is an international anti-racism treaty, to support our anti-racism work in the US. Many of you did not realize, number one, that there was an international anti-racism treaty, number two, that the US signed it, and number three, that our Senate ratified it. So anyway, so how can we use that, and how can we learn from anti-racism work in other nations? In terms of history, what is the history of successful anti-racism struggle in the US and around the world, and how can that history guide our work today? And how can we institutionalize attention to history in all decision-making processes? Shouldn't it be that every city council has a historian so that when the city council is trying to solve a problem, they understand how that problem got to be that way? In terms of liaison and partnership, what anti-racism work is happening at the community level? What anti-racism work is happening in other sectors outside of our own? And how can we create linkages? In terms of organizational excellence, this is how do we answer the question, how is racism operating here in each of our settings? And how do we examine structures, policies, practices, norms, and values? I've done some early thinking on that, but I would love people's support and help. How do you actually evaluate a policy? Policy and legislation, what are current policy and legislative strategies to address and dismantle racism, and what new strategies should we propose? What kinds of sample legislation should we pass around the country, and the like? In terms of science and publications, what research has been done already to look at the impacts of racism, not only on those who are unfairly disadvantaged, but on those who are unfairly advantaged, and how it saps the strength of the whole society. But beyond that, beyond creating the link, what intervention strategies have been evaluated? Who has been enriching the poor rocky soil, right? So that we can look the impact of that as opposed to just documenting the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. And what new measures and methods are needed? How do we measure racial climate? What about a measure of socially assigned race? All of those kinds of questions. I just wanted to say quickly that, and I won't stay here long, but when I convened and we formalized a CDC Racism and Health Work Group, 7 of these were our standing committees. We weren't onto needing history as part of it yet. Then when I was APHA president, this was a framework that I proposed, but APHA didn't have the way to support it. But then one of my friends, Chandra Ford, has taken this framework, and she's at UCLA, and she's put a placeholder there, but still no resources. And then my friend Michelle Morse has started a global aspect of this. She has a campaign against racism with 27 chapters around the world, in Haiti and Rwanda, here in Boston and Atlanta. I think some of the Boston chapter is here. Call out if you're here. Yeah, well, you can say something more than that. Anyway, so this is taking root, but this is where I'm inviting all of you to figure out how could our work connect. But this is all about collective action. I wanted to close with 2 other things. I want to go back to the dual reality and say at the individual level, you can already be anti-racist. You can, as a practice, look for the evidence of 2-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by economic status, by geography, and the like? We can all try to burst through bubbles to experience our common humanity. Each of us is in a bubble of experience, our work and all, and some of the bubbles are thin with soap bubble boundaries, and some of them are very thick with plexiglass boundaries that we're tinting and polarizing. But each of us is in a bubble where we do not know that just across town there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. We need to burst through our bubbles. We need to open that door in the restaurant to experience our common humanity in different settings. We need to be interested in the stories of others, believe the stories of others, and join in the stories of others. That even includes talking to strangers, right? We need to see the absence of. It's a fine skill, but I want each of you to develop the skill of saying who's not at the table, what's not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that could be put in place to make things better. And we need to reveal inaction in the face of need, because that is, for the most part, how institutionalized racism works, inaction in the face of need. But then I was doing this talk once, showing this story, and I realized that I hadn't put anything on the side of the people on the outside. So those of us who are outside, we need to know our power. We need to recognize that action is power, and we need to especially recognize that collective action is power. So my last story is to help us understand what we need to do to be actively anti-racist. This story, unlike the other 3 that I shared with you, is based not on something from my own real life, but on an image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. In her book, she talks about racism, like passive racism, basically is like living life on a conveyor belt, on an airport moving walkway where, you're just doing your job or whatever, but you're on this moving walkway that's moving inexorably through racism and toward racism. I want to take her image about racism for most people in this country as being a passive thing. I want to take that image and expand on it to talk about how we can become actively anti-racist. So here I am, putting us on the conveyor belt, and so we're just on the conveyor belt. So those of us of color are probably, underneath making the conveyor belt run, we're being overrun. But those who are, just passively anti-racist through benign inaction, we're just going to work, going to school, taking our kids to school, moving on this conveyor belt that's moving inexorably through racism and toward racism. And there's even a sign up there that says racism, racism, racism. But we're so involved in our lives that we don't even look up and see the sign, or we may look up and we see the sign and we go, oh, racism, and then we close our eyes and we're in denial and we stay on, right? Or maybe we look up and we say racism and we turn around, but we don't do anything else and we're still going in the same direction, so maybe we're colorblind. But what are we supposed to do? I ran out of conveyor belts, so let me get back over here. Okay, so what are we to do today? For those of you who may have been on the conveyor belt, and now you look up and you see racism, well, the first thing you need to do is to turn around, but you have to take a step, right? And you need to take another step, and you need to start walking at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving just to stay in the same place. That is, you have to become actively anti-racist. And let me ask you this. What happens when you're walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You start bumping into people, and it becomes uncomfortable for them and uncomfortable for you, and they're like, hey, buddy, watch out, which is your chance to do the first of the 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to name racism, to say, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there, or will you turn around with me? Now, most people do not want to be disturbed out of their comfort, so they just say, like, oh, just leave me alone. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn. So now you have 2 or 3 of you walking backwards on this crowded conveyor belt, and you keep bumping into people, and you keep naming racism and inviting people to turn, and more will turn, never 50%. Don't hold out your heart for 50%. But as more and more turn, you're now developing a critical mass, so now you don't even have to just stay in the same place. You can start moving, not just away from the sign, but where are you trying to get? You're trying to get to the motor that is making this conveyor belt run. So now that you're at the motor, now is the time for the second stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. So now I think it's this lever. So I'm going to pick the lever up and the whole system starts shaking, and I've done it, except racism is a very fancy system, so it reconfigures itself, and it keeps on going, which is about the importance of the third task of being actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act. So as I'm pulling on the lever, you need to push a button. You need to pull on that pulley. You need to swing that pendulum, and all of us need to take a piece of this system, because I earnestly do believe that if all of us take a piece of this system, if all of us become actively anti-racist, we can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. And I really do invite you into this effort. Thank you very much.